Good afternoon. I think we're going to start. Thanks for coming. My name is Mladen Kozul. I'm Associate Professor of French here at UM. And welcome to the panel consecrated to Western Europe and immigration crisis. When we first talked about this panel and discussed how to do it, we didn't know that the actuality is going to break in so violently as it did because of attacks that occurred in Brussels yesterday. So we have decided to modify a little bit our format. The initial idea was to present that each of the panelists presents for 15 minutes or so, and then we open the floor for the questions. We decided that we had much more things to say that are involved with immediate situation, and that it would be more convenient to adopt a roundtable format. What it means is that I will serve as a kind of TV anchor and start asking questions about present situation and its implications. At one point, quite rapidly, we would open the floor and allow you all to intervene with questions and comments. Let me start by presenting our panelists. For those of you who were here for this morning keynote presentation by Dominique Thomas, you know how honored we are to have a distinguished guest here. For those who are not here this morning, I would introduce him, and forgive me if you're listening to this for the second time. So Dominique Thomas is Mladen Latissier Professor and Chair of the Department of French and Francophone Studies at University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA. And he's also Professor of African, European, and Global Studies, and he directs the Center for the Study of Global France and the Global Studies Paris program. He's the author, co-author, editor, and co-editor of some 30 scholarly volumes. I will just give you the titles of a few of them. Black France, Colonialism, Immigration, and Transnationalism. Africa and France, Post-Colonial Cultures, Migration, and Racism. Museums in Post-Colonial Europe. A companion to comparative literature. La France Noire. Colonial Culture in France since the Revolution. Noir d'Encre. The Invention of Race, the Charlie Hebdo events and their aftermath, racial advocacy in France, and he is also author in the forthcoming Vers la guerre des identités, which will be published in a couple of weeks in France, and The Colonial Legacy in France. The book is in English. Dominique Thomas is a regular media commentator on contemporary French politics and culture, and African affairs as well. He also edits the Global African Voices series at Indiana University Press that focuses on translation of African literature in English. He is himself a translator. He has held fellowships, residences, and visiting professorships in a number of places and continents in Australia, the Congo, France, Germany, Mali, South Korea, United Kingdom, and the United States. And he was elected to Academy of Europe last year in 2015. Two other panelists who come from the University of Montana are Michel Valentin, our professor in the Department of Modern Classical Languages and Literatures. He serves French and West African cinema. He also is specialized in literature critical theory at UM, and he does cultural textual research from structuralist and post-structuralist and Lacanian psychoanalytic perspective. He published articles and is teaching member of EPIS. EPIS is acronym of Existential and Psychoanalytic Institute and Society, based in Missouri. Our third panelist is Henriette Lowisch, who is an international journalist and has worked across continents in media. She served as the 2006 Baldwin Professor and returned afterwards to Missouri in 2009 to join the School of Journalism's full-time faculty and direct its graduate program. Lowisch started out in journalism as a reporter for her hometown paper in the Black Forest in Germany. She was a freelance writer for a German women's magazine and an assistant news producer for Austrian television before joining Agence France Presse, AFP, the International Wire Service, in 1992. And then when at AFP, she served as copy editor, foreign correspondent in Brussels and Washington, editor-in-chief of the German service, the senior editor in charge of training, and received her professional training at Deutsche Journalistenschule in Munich, and earned her graduate diploma at Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich as well. Her thesis is about U.S. network television coverage of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Interesting subject, obviously essential. Global relations have been at the focus of her work, and this is what we'll certainly discover to be the case today. Let me then just mention that Professor Dominique Thomas just arrived from Europe, and I would like to start by asking him how does what's happening now at this moment correspond to the ideas he wanted to present when first coming here and proposing to treat the subject you have in your program.
Well, thanks for everybody for being here. Thanks, Professor Kozul, for introducing us. I'm delighted to be sharing this panel with Henriette and Michel. I already had a chance to speak for an hour and a half or so this afternoon, so I want others to be able to say some things. So just to open up a couple of comments. I think mentioning the Berlin Wall is really, quite striking, actually. It's not that long ago that wall came down, that Europe opened up in new and exciting but complex ways. And certainly the meeting of the East and the West have very much been important factors in the kinds of questions that we're looking up today, especially because walls are going up again. Europe is, in real terms, in concrete terms, and not just Europe, walls are going up again to block off, lock off, protect, whatever it is, or however it is that you want to look at it, different populations that feel that this is necessary. So what are we looking at this afternoon? We're looking at a number of issues that could be studied independently, but in fact are all somehow or other interrelated, either sociologically or politically, but certainly in the political rhetoric of heads of state, electoral candidates around the world today. It is a truly global problem that concerns terrorism, the migration crisis and the ways in which different organizations such as the European Union are struggling to define themselves at this moment of the 21st century. It's a global problem. It's a coincidence that we happen to be speaking in the aftermath of the terrible attacks that just occurred in Brussels. But there's nothing new about this. These attacks have taken place recently in the Ivory Coast, in Turkey, in Mali, in parts of Asia. I'm thinking of Bangkok. So the problem is truly globalized. And on a very positive note, there isn't one, because there are going to be more. There are going to be more in new and in different places, which is, of course, a problem, but it's also going to continue to fuel and exacerbate tensions, nervousness, fear, and of course the agendas of the political extreme right and increasingly mainstream political parties that are bolstering their electoral appeal by drawing on these different aspects, and I think actually by confusing the ways in which the electoral people bring together these disparate entities. So I'm hoping that through the roundtable and this discussion that we can break down some of the sort of awful and simplified ways in which these questions are being looked at today. Furthermore, in 2015 alone, Frontex, the European Union organization that monitors these questions, estimates about 1.8 million people attempting to seek entry into the European Union, a considerable increase over 2014, especially because of the deaths that also occurred through the precarious crossings of the Mediterranean, almost at sort of 4,000, a significant increase, but an increase that has to also be contextualized over a broader 15-year period in which over 20,000 people have died trying to make their way across the Mediterranean or towards Fortress Europe. The summer or the spring is approaching. There is absolutely no indication that there's going to be any kind of interruption in these migratory flows. About 140,000 people already since January have made the passage or have arrived in areas like Greece, heading over to Turkey, and so on too. So it's going to get worse over the summer months, without a doubt. And therefore, what we also need to be looking at are the push factors, right? Because the push factors are not getting any better. Whether you're in Nigeria fleeing Boko Haram, whether you are in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, escaping conflict, or in areas like Kosovo or Eritrea, fleeing poverty, or escaping from dictatorial regimes and so on and so forth, the push factors are enormous, and the pull factors in terms of what the European Union potentially represents for individuals are not going to go away. So we're going to see a rise of political rhetoric of the sort of protecting the local community, strengthening borders, control, surveillance, and so on and so forth, which will of course further exacerbate racial profiling, issues around these sorts of issues that we will be looking at, and also, as I mentioned this afternoon, I think an increasing attempt to define these outsiders as migrants rather than as refugees, which dramatically shifts the burden of responsibility from the European Union. So I think we need to look at that as well, and we also need to question the entire concept or idea of the European Union, which I take the opportunity to remind us that it is a democratic group of nations that prides itself on some particular principles that are certainly being placed under pressure by the role that Turkey has been invited or asked to play in this particular situation, which has involved a process of negotiation that will potentially fast-track the consideration of Turkey for EU membership, the provision of visas to people in Turkey as early as the month of June, and entry into the Schengen zone, as well as the way in which different organizations and governments are seeking to handle the migration crisis by introducing increasingly harsh control measures, selection measures, as they deal with this particular context. So I hope that we can spend some time exploring these sorts of questions, and I certainly know that from the sort of expertise of different members on the panel that the comparative context is also very interesting. You know, what's happening in the EU, what's happening in Germany, in France, and and so on.
Yes, and this collusion between the political processes and the continuation of migrant flows, I was thinking that maybe the way the migration crisis fuels extreme right and right-wing politics in Europe. We had an example of this happening in Germany. Actually, the last elections were regional elections, and Merkel's party didn't go so well for Merkel, right?
Yes, that's true. First of all, also thanks for having me. The other thing I want to say very briefly is that I used to live in Brussels, so what happened there happened pretty close to where I used to live, and if I wasn't here with you today, I would just be at home crying or something like that. But to your question, yes, so for those of you who don't follow Germany news that closely, which I think is totally legit, there were elections in 3 of the 16 German states a couple of weeks ago, and states are important in a similar way than they are in the United States, so they are in charge of dossiers like education, for example, police, and so on. And so 3 states, 2 of them being in the former West Germany, so typically rich states. One of them, Baden-Württemberg, is the state where they make the cars, the Daimlers, the Mercedeses. The other is Rheinland-Pfalz, where they make the German Rhine wine and where you go on these cruises along the Rhine. And then the third is in the east, Sachsen-Anhalt, and the east, as you probably know, is an economically depressed area still, depopulated area and so on. So in all 3 of these elections, a party called the Alternative for Germany, die Alternative für Deutschland, scored very highly. It's the first time they just appeared on the scene a couple of years ago, so they competed in these elections for the first time. In the western states, they got about 11-12% of the vote, and in Saxony-Anhalt, they got a whopping 24%. As you probably know, the way the political system in Germany works is different from here in the sense that parties have to form these coalitions to govern, right? So they can't, the system isn't set up the way that one party rules. So this has kind of created a lot of difficulty in forming state governments, but it's also led the media in Germany, the political elites in Germany to a lot of soul searching. Okay, what's happening? What's going on here? How much of this vote is a protest type of vote? Will they just go away? Or is Germany just catching up with the right-wing populist movements that have been very successful, for example, in France, right? So is Germany kind of catching up, or is this a one-off phenomenon that will disappear, possibly? Right.
So last year alone, 1 million people more or less entered Germany, correct? And so it has not been long ago, but still I imagine there were some ways of dealing with influx that have been put in place. So can you tell us what has been done? And then secondly, obviously there's collusion between, at least in popular discourse and with right-wing parties, the collusion between migrants and terrorists, right? And this is where, this is the terrain in which the right-wing is progressing. And so obviously what happened in Brussels will not do away with this. On the contrary, it will fuel more the same phenomenon. But are there any solutions that kind of emerge in German public space, in public discourse, in political discourse? How can you tell what's other signs?
I think that's an interesting question that I didn't quite expect. And I'm trying to, I don't want to, I want to kind of gather my thoughts for a moment here. Yes, you know, the Germans pride themselves, for better or worse, to be a very organized society. And what happened, you know, 1.1 million people entering Germany seeking refuge, just overwhelmed even the German bureaucracy, right? So one part of the discontent, I think, in Germany has to do with things just not working as smoothly anymore as people were used to, right? In addition to that, what was probably the most kind of impactful event, and I'm sure you've all heard about this, is what the tabloids in Germany call the disgrace of Cologne, right? And this is, you know, what happened on New Year's Eve in Cologne when, you know, a mob of men, mostly men, young men, kind of, within, there was like a huge crowd on this square, and within this crowd were groups of young men who actually later turned out mostly were of North African origin, who started circling around women, groping them, insulting them, and by the way, using the kind of turmoil and distraction that created to steal things, right? To pickpocket. And you know, for many reasons that I'm happy to kind of tell you more about that if you're interested in the details, but for many reasons it took a while until the German establishment kind of admitted that the perpetrators were mostly of North African origin. Now, of course, then immediately the connection was made between these perpetrators and the refugees now who have entered Germany, mostly from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq since last year, right? It turns out, you know, once the smoke was kind of had cleared a little bit, that that's not the case, that actually, you know, of the, I don't know, 80 or 90 perpetrators that were identified, I think there were 2 Syrians or something, right? Just to give you some kind of scale. But in Germany, it's not, the establishment and the kind of mainstream center left does not distinguish between different groups of immigrants because they believe that you shouldn't kind of separate people into groups and decide these are kind of the good migrants and these are the bad migrants, right? Nevertheless, okay, so this, the so-called disgrace of Cologne outraged, I would say, the general population in Germany, right? And it has triggered many subsequent decisions and events. One of them, though, was a tightening, like Dominique said, right? A tightening of policy. For example, you know, it's now easier to deport, let's say, people from North Africa who commit crimes, even if these crimes are not violent crimes, right? Even if they're pickpocketing, even if they're kind of verbal insults, right? It's easier now to kind of deport them than it was before. And so okay, I have to kind of find the way. So on the one hand, the solution of the government has been to tighten the rules. On the other hand, the idea of Angela Merkel's government has been throughout this, I need to get the Europeans on board to find a European solution. So we all march together here, right? And this is what has been so incredibly difficult in the past, 3 or 4 months. It's also been why it's contributed to this far-right party ascending, because they say Merkel doesn't have things in hand. And it might mean that the more attacks like in Brussels occur, though, that people actually, Germans might be more inclined to go back to Merkel because they trust her more to lead in a situation of crisis, right, than they trust like some obscure party that is only 3 years old. So it goes both ways.
Yes, and then Michel was using the deterrorization concept to, how does it, those events in Cologne, how would you link? I mean, it was obviously, if not in reality, at least, in terms of media and of impact on public opinion, that is really one of the central events lately. Can you manage this within the perspective you wanted to propose?
Yes, of course. I'll speak very fast so everybody has a chance to speak later. So, but not too fast because otherwise my Irish accent is going to come up, as you say. And also you're lucky that this format has changed because then you'll be spared my 15 minutes of theory drowning you. So anyway, yes, my approach is very complementary to yours. That is to say that for a certain theoretical approach, immigration and terrorism are two faces of the same coin. How so? First, that they are the product, and you did a fantastic job, I repeat this, at noon, to present us how the traditional and the French connection, the history, the neocolonialism. But there's also something else, which is postmodernism, globalization. We all tout in America globalization, although it's starting to be different with the discourse of the presidential candidates. Globalization is not good or doesn't work the same way for everybody. So there's a concept linked to globalization, postmodernism. It deterritorializes from Deleuze, meaning it displaces you from your surrounding, your country, of course, immigration, right? Immigration, people are not living as refugees or immigrants, Africa or Near East just for travel as tourists, they are forced to. And what forces them? A certain economical, political situation. And then terrorism is also a reaction to this globalization. Remember, capitalism has won. Global capital has won. The enemy of capitalism used to be Marxism, socialism. It's gone. Well, when you have a system which is hegemonic, it goes without saying there's a logic in that system which produces its own antibody. Now it's terrorism using, or fundamental terrorism using Islam as an excuse, or using a fantasy of Islam. So Europe is also deterritorialized, perhaps Germany less because it's a very successful economy. I hope it carries on. But in France, it's like when Trump says we lost all those jobs. It's due to the system, to the logic of the system. France has lost millions of jobs, outsourcing, etc. You know the whole story. So a lot of people feel deterritorialized. They are not losing their benefit yet, but France overspends, is very indebted. There is a crisis, an anxiety. And of course, in those cases, what do? And I brought the schema of the unconscious and the subject. You project on the other, on the perceived foreigner, on the perceived enemy, on the intruder. You project by a very complex system, your fear, your anxiety on the other, right? It's called racism, xenophobia. And you have a convergence of two situations. And what happened in Köln and other cities, I think, in a way, it doesn't matter really if they're refugee, although, yeah, it makes a difference, I agree, but when you have young men who come from a different culture, if they are relatively recent refugee, they arrive in Germany, well, they've been there for a while, they're excluded up to a point. There is a certain relation or non-relation through women. And women are, might we like it or not, the symbol of affluence, especially on the sexual level. Remember the key word of our economy is our system, enjoy. It's not repress like in different, traditional Muslim culture, it's not repress, it's enjoy, consume, buy, have sex, right? So there is a clash there. I think even if it's used by the extreme right, you have to see this kind of sad encounter from that point of view. Something happened where you have a clash of, in a way, of two systems which are not compatible for the time being. Of course, with time, immigrants, refugees accommodate, change their own value. Okay, but it's not that important, perhaps not from a feminist point of view, but I think it's a micro event. It's not. I don't know. Anyway.
Yes, thanks, Michel. Guys?
No, go ahead.
No, go. And I'd love to say a few things. But
Something that I want to add to this discussion about the what happened in Cologne. So, and I don't know whether that fits with your thoughts, Michel. I think the reason why people in Germany were so taken aback by what happened in Cologne is not because they're not familiar with unpleasant things happening in huge crowds of people, right? But because they recognize something that many women have experienced, which I'm going to try to describe in the following. Germans are not very, how should I say, they're kind of, the way I can easily explain that is when German students, female students go to the south of Europe and they walk around and the men whistle after them, right, then this is not something Germans are used to, because it's not like the way we act. I mean, we all have our codes and our taboos and our ways of interacting, right? And this is actually really a little bit comparable. So the South has, in a way, come to Germany. So women experience this, that newcomers, immigrants, do that, right? You walk down the street and somebody whistles at you, right? And makes stupid comments at you as a woman. So what happened in Cologne kind of made everybody think, yes, this is exactly what I'm experiencing, right? On a daily basis, although I'm kind of almost exaggerating a little bit, because I personally don't experience it, but maybe for whatever reasons, right? I'm like a tank or something like that, right? So, a lot of women recognized the situation in a less extreme way, right? Because at that square, there was the crowd and you couldn't escape, whereas, of course, if you walk down the street, you can escape. Now, the problem is that my fear is that this creates a situation of ghettos, because what actually happens is that women move away from neighborhoods where they encounter this, and then, what happens is, suddenly Germany becomes much more like countries that have this segregation, if that makes sense. Whereas at this point, in general, in German cities, there's more of a mix, right? There's a mix of different cultures and people from different countries, right? So that's kind of beyond the politicians trying to exploit this event, right, for their purposes. That's the real kind of basic truth here, the basic problem that needs to be addressed, right? And that can't be wiped away. It can't be ignored, right? The problem that, for whatever reason, Michelle has a better way to explain why this might be, but the experience of you walk around and men on the street, young men, they're all young men, behave in a way that you don't like, because this is not how you want to live. This is not how you've grown up. This is not what your kind of society, how your society works.
Yes.
No, and I could not disagree with you. I mean, it's absolutely correct. I think that between what you say and what Michel say, there is nevertheless a difference, because I do think it's important to, I really think that the distinction, and Cologne was so important in that, is that the majority of people that were involved in those acts, whatever they were, whether it's pickpocketing, molesting, and so on, were not refugees, were not recent migrants, right? Which is, of course, the way in which the media overwhelmingly represented it, right? There's this external threat. We need to lock down. We will protect our citizens from that. But in fact, from immigrants, so people who are living and working or trying to work in Germany, actually, but struggling to get legal papers and so on, who I would argue have lived there and been there long enough that they actually very much understand the codes and the ways in which sort of behavior is tolerated in Germany, and so that you can't take away from the experience of the women, but it's also important to identify individuals away from that sort of political rhetoric and to talk about delinquents and deviants, and to give agency to them in that particular process, right? So that it's not an entire community or religion that is reduced to that kind of behavioral pattern, right? And I think that's often lost in the discussion, right? It's like all Muslims behave that way, right? When in fact, the question of autonomy and agency and choice is very important in this, which leads me to sort of think about another kind of question, which is the whole issue of identification and empathy and remembering the kind of the humanitarian aspect of this, which is lost in these kinds of debates and issues. So we know, for example, the incredibly powerful impact last summer that the image of the young Syrian boy who'd washed up on the Turkish shore played out, right? And there was a lot of discussion about that, which led to a very significant debate within the European Union, primarily fueled by the Swedish Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, who explicitly said, "My Europe takes in refugees," right? So he's thinking about the pressures that, say, the Hungarian, president, was under, and the response of Hungary of putting up barbed wire and talking about building a wall, versus recognizing the real humanitarian responsibility that Europe has historically in terms of military action and so on and so forth, but also thinking about this in terms of the real refugee crisis and how Europe, with its complicated history, has a responsibility to address these kinds of problems in these particular ways. And the unfortunate aspect of it is that the political rhetoric has been so debasing, so lacking in kind of empathy, that even in the terms of the language itself, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier today, that when we talk about clandestines, undocumented, illegals and so on and so forth. In fact, we're not talking about human beings anymore. We're talking about categories, groupings and so on, in which the names of these people, their particular stories are lost, what it is they want, where they come from, and what's driving them to make these extraordinarily complex choices, which involve boarding makeshift, precarious crafts, crossing the Mediterranean with their children, with the full understanding that surviving that trip is unlikely, And I think that aspect of it is really, really important in understanding that people aren't fleeing Syria to come and blow people up in Belgium. They're fleeing Syria because they live in circumstances in which there is no future, that are untenable, and they continue to see in Europe the very values that Europe is struggling to sort of address, of enlightenment, of progress, and so on. They're not coming there to destroy these things, but to find new lives and to find a future.
Yes, of course. And then just to add one thought to what you're saying, you see people who flee Syria and war in Iraq and surrounding countries, what they actually try to escape from is exactly the things that were arriving in Paris and Brussels these last weeks and months. It is their experience. And it's not only their experience, they've experienced it 10,000 times more in a more violent manner, which then implies that when all these people come to Europe, and then Europeans experience this kind of violence, this should, according to some kind of commonsensical logic, should reinforce the empathy, the humanitarian, the feeling for the fellow human. And yet, what is happening? It's rather that recent migrants, are rejected because of the collusion between immigration, or rather migration, and terrorism. So it's a paradoxical turn of events which complicates things even further.
Can I add something very fast? Speaking about this delinquency, what happened in Cologne, things which are no-no, they are taboo now. They are part of the social code. It's a sign, it's a symptom. It's what I perhaps meant to explain further. It's a symptom of exclusion. The same happened in Toulouse or in Paris or in different European, say, or French city. If you ask our students who go to Toulouse or with a lot of exchange, many female students come back and they say, well, it was everything was fine, great, except I had to be used to be catcalled or insulted when I was biking down. You can rent bike in Toulouse, especially if I wear scampy skirt, etc., or clothes. And of course, those cars would go by with Arab music blaring and young men making derogatory or sexist comments, right? So there's this type of small delinquency, microaggression, to use the term, is part of daily life. It's a symptom of rejection. I'm not excusing it. The thing is try to explain in order to address it. It comes from generally, and it's not exclusionary, there's also French, whatever that means now, dude, guy, very good rugby players maybe doing that. But there is this, it's a symptom, right? A symptom of a deeper malaise in society. And women or young women are often the first receptacle. That's what I meant.
If all this, our discussions and the points we brought up, if you will intervene, please do. Please give us your questions, your comments. We can engage in general discussion if you feel like. I will help people who are close to me. So with the mic I have in my hand, but I would like to point out to you that we have a microphone there in between the two parts of the rows, and so you can use this one. And I will allow myself to help the gentleman here.
Some of the reading I've had is that the problems in Syria first came about as a result of 6 or 7 years of famine in which lots of the rural people moved to the big cities, in which the government was unable to deal with that. So my question has to do with a larger issue of global climate change and how that is fueling the mass migrations and the refugee issues and the instability of governmental entities to manage the kind of problems that are being created as a result of what we're all experiencing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one very quick thing, then other panelists will respond. So the whole field, and it's becoming a field, of environmental migration or environmentally related migration is becoming a significant, is receiving increasing attention, right? It's often, of course, environmental problems are push factors. They drive people out of communities. No more water, no land, and so on. The broader aspect of we think of environment as just nature and so on, but the environment that is created by dictatorship, by a lack of political stability. The statistic came out about 10 years ago during one of the major conflicts in eastern Congo, so the eastern part of the DRC, that for every person that died in the conflict, ethnic cleansing, however you want to categorize it, 60 other people died, right? Because it drives people out of communities. You run, you abandon your medication, your access to healthy water, you're entering into conflict zones and so on and so forth. So I think that these kinds of aspects, let alone access to food, medication and so on, are incredibly important, and especially on the African continent today, right? We remember, historically the significant kind of famines, Ethiopia and so on too. But there are many areas that are right on, the sort of the point of entering into this sort of thing. And I would also talk about the sort of circumstances in which this burgeoning number of displaced peoples, somewhere around 60 to 80 million right now worldwide, and also the conditions in which these migrants that are arriving in Greece or in Turkey are living under, right, which are also majorly problematic environmental factors, right? Living in camps, lack of water, healthy food, and so on too, are very important factors,
Yes, another question or comment?
Yes, this is kind of a follow-up to his question. Some of the early migrants, I want to know, they all have to pay smugglers, right? So, of course, families, just like people coming out of Tibet and so on, try to gather up their money. Were some of the earlier ones or the current ones people of middle class, like the doctors? That's what I have heard to be, because they'd have to get money together. So the ones that are left behind must be very poor, right? Is that correct? Or what? Do we know any statistics on that?
I mean, one thing that's, I can only speak, not as well armed with facts as Dominic is. But the first wave of refugees from Syria, especially, that came to Germany were mostly middle class and even more than middle class. And if you look at the 1.1 million and where they ended up going and how, to what degree the German taxpayer has to pay for them, there's actually quite a number of them who have enough funds to rent a place, and go out on their own. And I personally know people like that, right? The North African immigrants, I would say that's a totally different situation. A lot of them are almost like they indenture themselves, so they borrow money, or their families borrow poor money to have one person to be able to make the trip, right, which costs like something like $5,000. So people pool their money, and then this one person is supposed to send home remittances over the years, right? That person is then supposed to find a foothold in a European country, find a job, and give a large part of their incomes back to their families back home. This is like a totally normal phenomenon that exists everywhere in the world. The only problem with this particular group of immigrants is they're not allowed to work, because they are illegal, and it's not like in the United States where you can actually, a lot of people can actually make a living working illegally. The German bureaucracy, for that, it really works well, right? So these people, there's no way for them to make any money other than deal drugs and then work in the shadow economy, nightclubs, or theft, burglaries, and so on, right? But they're still obligated to send this money home to their families and to their communities, right? I mean, I have no sympathy for anybody, who steals my money or burglarizes me, but it's totally logical how this system works.
Right. As a follow-up question to that, from a letter I just got from Germany, can you say anything about the Merkel government at least trying to get them into German schools? Because I understand that's being held back too. Is that true? That they're teaching them German? Mm-hmm. Because they don't have asylum yet or haven't been vetted yet or whatever.
So the German government now has kind of created a category that's like the people who are likely to be granted asylum in Germany, which is true, for example, for all Syrians, since Merkel said we will take all Syrians, right? So this is, yes, so while they're waiting, so of the 1.1 million, there were 500,000 asylum applications last year in Germany. So you wonder what happened to the other 600,000 people. Well, a lot of them, the majority of them, have not even been able to make the first step to apply for asylum yet, right? This is crazy, but there's just, so it's a failure of administration. So this new rule says that if you're Syrian and you can show you're Syrian, or this is true for most people from Iraq, also in Eritrea, certain countries, your children can go to school immediately, no matter how long this process is going to work. Yes, and all the Syrian families I personally know in Berlin, their children went to school almost immediately. They've been, when I go back there in May, I expect that the children know so much German that they can translate for their parents. It's key to do this, right? It's great,
What about the young men? Are they being kept from the
they are kind of out of school age, right? They are too old to go to school. So it's more difficult. Because the classes cost money, right? But there's one area where the volunteerism in Germany, which is huge, I mean, unimaginable, the breadth of the volunteer culture right now is working best. I mean, everyone and their sister is teaching German to someone. That's not the problem, right? Somebody who wants to learn German will learn German and get German classes, really.
A quick fact to answer your question there also. You know that all the money sent by those guest workers, illegal workers, back to Africa, to their family, that's superior in amount to the dollar, the Western aid to Africa. It's something tremendous, tremendous.
Yes, first the young man and then the lady.
Hi, and I'm glad that that question was brought up a couple times ago about the kind of the shade economy and everything. That goes right into my question. Because we have established that these violent outbreaks, as in Cologne, cannot be blamed in actuality specific to migrants and refugees, we have to find a more true root to these problems. And if we talk about what Monsieur Valentin was saying about rejection and things of these people that come into this society, we see, for instance, Victor Hugo tells us that la pauvreté est la mère de crime, that poverty is the mother of crime. And so how can we reformulate the way we are dealing with this difficult question of how to help or organize refugees and migrants to better attack the root problem, which comes from these established peoples who are more or less forced into poverty because of their unfortunate situation and because of the difficulty that they meet with the established culture and people of the country in which these immigrants and refugees find themselves?
That's a difficult one. You do.
No. So I pass it to you.
Yeah.
He mentioned you.
Well, okay. Okay, I should bring my best Irish accent there. Well, no, you're right, but, let's put a little historical perspective. We all remember that cartoon from Plantu in the Monde. There's a Western tourist in Egypt, and of course, just after the horrible attacks, okay, which, by the way, as you said, happened constantly in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Sudan, and in Syria on everyday basis, and in Western Africa, not every day, but often. The tourist looks at the Sphinx and says, why? Meaning, why all this hate and attack? Remember that if you look at the contemporary history of the Middle East, and I wish Mladen was there, the Near East, the West, America, France, Western interests, Great Britain made sure to suppress any alternative to development which was not pro-Western, pro-capitalist. Look at the number of leaders from Nasser to Ben Barka in Morocco who were suppressed, and they had a movement behind. They wanted a national-based type of development, which was not necessarily Soviet, as the West would say, but not necessarily following blindly capitalism. All those movements were suppressed. And what was left? Well, nothing except dictator. And then, starting with when the Soviet invaded Afghanistan, remember how the US cultivated one of the most extreme freedom fighter. He was not called freedom fighter, thanks for South America, but he was an extremist Wahhabite, espousing the most reactionary form of religion. So the West has not given a chance in a way. So in a way we are, through the unconscious, through the irony of history, we are ripening what we have sown. The chicken are coming home to roost, and we shouldn't forget that. So poverty, right? I mean, and globalization, what globalization does to many countries, look in Egypt. I mean, it's, anyway, so.
But the responsibility of France in this, let alone other European colonial powers or those that were peripherally, engaged in this, is absolutely, an incontrovertible fact. The whole process of, first of all, of colonial exploitation, and subsequently the ways in which the French state, remember that the continent of Africa only entered the realm of the Department of Foreign Affairs, in other words, the French equivalent of the State Department, about 10 years or so. Prior to that, the African continent, from independence in essentially 1960, was run out of the Élysée, out of the cellule africaine, the French cell, right, through a process known as France-Afrique, which is a sort of, play on the word fric and money and so on and so forth, that elections were controlled, military support provided for certain institutions and so on, so that the crisis one finds, and of course, once again, African intellectuals and individuals will say that it's their responsibility. They can't keep blaming colonialism and France and so on too. They must also seek greater transparency and accountability. But we see what's happening just over the weekend, the vote in Congo, the small Congo Brazzaville, that Sassou Nguesso, who keeps changing his Wikipedia page because in the constitution, at 70, you can no longer hold office, right? So he gets younger every year. So he's not supposed to be. And secondly, he last year changed for a forced ballot and gave him permission to run for another term in office, right? He was greeted and welcomed at the Élysée with a red carpet. Last summer, he was a guest of honor in Washington, D.C. at the African Summit. These leaders are supported. They have oil. Europe wants the oil, and it's not just Europe. And that continues to be a major problem. So as tough as as Fortress Europe gets, as much money as they give to third countries to hold these people or to prevent them from entering, the basic fact is there are push factors on the ground. And the question earlier, is interesting because there's a tremendous disparity between migrants, and migrants coming from, say, sub-Saharan Africa are not seeking to leave because their dream is to live in Europe. And in fact, many of them are going to other areas of the world, Guangzhou in southern China, going towards Latin America. We saw in the first election of Obama, the whole question of between African American and African descendants living in the United States has become important. Europe is not automatically the dream, but in sub-Saharan Africa, the level of education and literacy is extraordinarily high. Underfunded, but very good education systems, but no opportunities, right? No jobs, no future. What do? You pack up and you go, right? That's it.
Also to answer, that's just a quick idea, very fast. What to do? The French government has tried to do it, but a lot of those terrorists and problematic youth as you explained, are in the suburbs, the banlieue of Paris, the ex-Red Belt, where the workers, the communist workers used to vote at, and live. Now it's the second generation sons of immigrants. And one way would be to give them political representation, right? To give to the banlieue, to cut the banlieue in arrondissement, political arrondissement, and give them representation so they can elect their own. And that's a solution. I don't know if it will. Or give microcredits, like the IMF does, give microcredits in Senegal to women who start little enterprises. Finally, they're doing that, instead of giving the money to the dictator or disappears in Switzerland, or to give money to microcredits, little enterprise in the suburbs. It's not being done, right? Though there are a solution, but is it
And
politics?
they know the problem is there, right? Even Nicolas Sarkozy, when he was elected in 2007, talked about, he said, we need a Marshall Plan for the banlieue.
Exactly.
Right? And then he appointed a minister for urban housing, and the budget was zero. Right? So nothing happened. It was talk, it was representational, etc. We move on through this to, Manuel Valls talking about the fact that there's an apartheid in France. I mean, they're his words, an apartheid in France, that there are conditions, lifestyles in these housing projects that are analogous to the kinds of segregationist models that were previously found in the US, in South Africa, in the townships, and so on. So what do we do about it? But what do? Nothing. There's no money, there's no funding, there's no initiative to help trying to transform those particular spaces.
As you said earlier, how many non-white French are in the parliament? Although
Basically, there's a handful today.
that's
right.
practically
Right. And so
except
you've
for
had
Prime Minister
well,
of State.
the first Hollande government was aware of these kinds of measures. So the first, the 2012 government that Hollande put together had 34 ministers, 17 women, 17 men. Okay, that's an important step. There's also an important recognition in France. It's the only sort of abrogation, one could argue, to the constitution that you're just French, is they actually legally recognize that men and women are different. Right? But they won't recognize that, ethnic minorities, religion, and so on could be a problem, right? So that first Hollande government had in office a whole range of ethnic minorities, right? That were also appointed to these things. But as time has gone on and the government has been reshuffled, you've had an increasing, a less and less visibility in this particular space. But representation in parliament is absolutely abysmal when you look at the overall, demographics of the country. The French parliament does not represent the demographics of the country, nor does it represent the gender divide, right? Because there's a huge gender problem in terms of representation as well, right? Political parties are supposed to support parité, right? To allow an equal number of women to run for political office, right? Or to pay fines, right? And both parties would rather pay fines than run women in certain constituencies, right? So they will run women in areas they know they will lose. And so you end up with a number that has nothing to do with the 50% population divide that you have in France. So there's a major problem there.
Let's go back to Germany.
We don't have that problem.
So the next question, comment, comes from here.
My question is, what do you do about cultural and legal issues in a country when you have a rash of refugees and displaced persons? For example, a child bride who comes in married at 14 to a 50-year-old man, or health issues such as female genital mutilation, or patriarchal honor killing. I mean, these things come with your population, and how do you deal with them?
I don't really know very much about this. So, good question. Honor killings, so-called honor killings, are the only of these three things you cited that are likely to actually occur in Germany, right? Once people have settled there. My sense is that if I look back over 20 years in Berlin, watching the kind of number of occurrences of honor killings, I think, the heyday when this made headlines, when cases were very prominent, is maybe 10 years ago. So I'm just deducing from this, right, that there has been a decline, or that kind of, the German state, German legal system has made it clear that that's not acceptable, is my sense. But I don't know, Dominique, do you know more about this and can back that up? Or
On a couple of issues. So, for example, Belgium, right? Since we've been talking about Belgium, commissions that work on racial equality, integration, immigration, and so on and so forth are very clear. You come to Belgium, there are rules and regulations that are in place. You can practice religion, you can pray in the streets, you can wear a headscarf, you can do A, B, C, D, etc. It doesn't matter where you come from and what happens there, but we have certain rules and regulations that are in place. You may, in your particular culture, home, etc., not tolerate homosexuality. You cannot kill people for being homosexual or beat them up. That is against the law. The law is very clear on a broad range of questions, right? What you mentioned, though, is that the crux of the whole issue of global migration and circulation is that immigration, historically, everywhere, introduces difference, right? It introduces difference. So it's about the host. When someone comes into your house, there are certain codes, rules, and behaviors, but you hope that the host can also work with the guest and the guest with the host, right? It's a process of mutual accommodation. So I'll give you one concrete example because you mentioned female genital mutilation, right? So in the 1980s in France, there is nowhere on any legal document a banning or outlawing of the practice of female circumcision or excision, right? Because it's not practiced culturally. The only history of it in France is in the history of medicine. There's a time, historically where women were excised in French hospitals if they were, quote, hysteric or had mental illness and so on and so forth. But it's not a cultural practice. But a young woman, a girl, who was living in a French housing project, who was from Mali, and some African countries have it as a sort of, as a practice, or some communities or ethnic group. But her particular group she came from in Mali practiced excision. And rather than sending her back over the summer vacation to be excised, they brought in an exciser from Mali who performed the excision in the home in which they live, and the young girl died, right? So, of course, in France, you're not allowed to kill people, and you're not allowed to cut parts of people's bodies, and et cetera, et cetera. So there was a trial. What came out of this trial, which was so interesting, is that the prosecution were using words like barbaric, uncivilized, mutilation, and so on and so forth, right? Which, of course, had very problematic kind of colonial histories of defining the other and so on. So it became a trial about culture and about trying to explain that at no moment did the family perform this practice with the intention of killing their daughter. They actually performed it for what they believed was her good, to enhance her position within the community, to make her acceptable, marriageable, and so on and so forth. But following that particular process, French law changed. So there is now a law on the books that makes the performance of female excision and circumcision illegal on French territory. Right? So this is a typical example of how immigration has changed these particular dynamics. And you could see similar kinds of mechanisms being implemented with some of the other questions that you mentioned that do exist, that are very small in numbers, but are nevertheless issues in societies that don't allow or have moved along or have a different way of dealing with these kinds of questions and so on.
Yes, in fact, to add to this, it's a very good example. By the way, watch the Ousmane Sembène movie Mladen. It's about excision in Western Africa. But often those practices which are illegal in Europe are used in ethnic group or as a mean of resistance to the host culture, which is overwhelming. This is kind of strange. It's kind of perverted. Okay, it's like you use this, which may be on the wane, even in Africa, in many countries, of course, where with education and women's rights, but you use it to counteract magically and consciously from, whatever dimension, to counteract this hegemony, this French or European hegemony of you should do this is the right way to do things, etc. So it's very difficult.
It's actually one of the ways in which new technology and internet and so on have transformed things. There's an area of Berlin that my colleague will know well, in Kreuzberg, which repeatedly is used by the Western media as a symbol, or was at least 10 years ago, of kind of of the unwillingness of certain Turkish migrants to integrate into Germany. So it's this area of Kreuzberg where the whole building have satellite dishes, right? And they argue that this shows that they're not connected to Germany. They're using the dishes to be able to sort of, like crabs, walk along. We're in Germany, but we're looking back to other areas, Turkey, Algeria, and so on too. But the actual interesting thing goes to the heart of what you just said, is that actually migrants move in a time bubble, right, with their luggage, their baggage, cultural, and so on, and they remember home. But home has changed, right? So new technologies, Skype, internet, digital, whatever it is, dishes and so on and so forth, have actually enhanced kind of contact with the countries of home, right? To realize that there have been incredible changes and advances on these particular questions, and that actually some of the migrant practices are completely out of date with the very cultures they believe they're preserving through these kinds of practices. So it's an interesting way in which they are also transformed.
And then obviously the moment of realization that the country is imaginary country, of course, fuels even more, the resentment and the sense of the need to find a radical solution to it.